Middle Path Radio, your source of Islamic knowledge.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum everybody. Welcome to this special edition of THMP event in association with Straight Talk, which is part of the Middle Path Radio. Tonight's event is being broadcast live via the web and the Middle Path Radio usual channels. I am Waqil Ahmed, those of you who don't know me, and inshallah I will be your host for this evening's event. For any new brothers who are not familiar with THMP, I'll give a bit of a background into what THMP does, and then I'll move on to Straight Talk. THMP has been running for several years now in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets. It is a professionals networking forum where like-minded Muslim professionals gather to share ideas and discuss about issues that affect the Muslims, whether in this country or abroad. THMP has a proven track record of providing very lively discussions and debates and rather lovely dinners. And inshallah tonight we will not let you down either. You will enjoy the dinner at the end of the show. In terms of Straight Talk, it is a live weekly radio show which is broadcast via the Middle Path radio channel. And it is normally broadcast on a Wednesday evening via, and is available subsequently via YouTube channels. So inshallah, in terms of the show tonight, obviously 2016 is coming to a close, and just as the previous years, 2016 has been a rather eventful year. We will tonight discuss about some of the major events that have taken place this year, and I'm sure there are plenty of events that we could include, but due to shortage of time, we will restrict ourselves. No doubt you will have your views about what's happened over the last 1 year and on some of the events, and you will have drawn some of your conclusions. And perhaps you have some questions to discuss or debate with others. Inshallah, tonight we will facilitate all of that. Like many, you may be an optimist or possibly a pessimist about the year ahead. We will see, inshallah, how we should perhaps proceed after this evening's event. Now, I could include many of the events that have happened in the past year, but as I say, due to shortage of time, I will restrict this evening's discussion to the following areas. Number one, the ongoing killings and oppression in Burma. The cataclysmic failure of the Muslim rulers in relation to Syria and the ongoing killings by Assad's forces. I'll also discuss about Donald Trump's recent election victory. As you're aware, he will become the US president in January. I will then discuss the Brexit issue and how this has given rise to xenophobia and Islamophobia in this country. And if we have time, we may also discuss about Prevent and related issues. So to discuss all of this, I'm privileged to have two brothers on the panel. We have, on my far left, Jamal Harwood. Jamal Harwood is a Muslim economist and a political commentator on issues that affect Muslims and Islam generally. He has been engaged in the Islamic Dawah activities for the last 20 years, and he has traveled widely in the Muslim world to give lectures and seminars and has appeared on TV on numerous times. He is a distinguished public speaker within the UK Muslim community. On my immediate left, I have Adnan Khan, who is a prolific writer and is engaged in the dawah over the last 15 years or so. Adnan writes for various online publications on issues that affect the Muslims, whether in Britain or abroad. Adnan is a regular political commentator, and he provides political analysis on emerging issues for his online publications. So that is my panel. In terms of the format, very briefly, we will have brief, probably 3 to 5 minutes presentations by the panel members. They'll sort of make their opening remarks, and thereafter, inshallah, we will move to some questions and answers. Again, I would like this session to be about you rather than the panel. I want this session to be very lively and inshallah I want to encourage debate. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jamal. But before I do that, I should say, inshallah, dinner will be served at the end of the show this evening. So over to Brother Jamal.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum, and a very warm welcome to you all. I'd just like to start by saying, when I look back over this year, obviously the current events in Aleppo are really dominating our thoughts and our prayers and our dua, and our focus, rightly at the moment, is really on this massacre which we're seeing unfolding before us. But I will just remind you that this is more than 5 years since this uprising, which is a peaceful uprising against the regime, the oppressive regime of Assad, and that it has not been able to be crushed despite all of these actions, including this current one in Aleppo. This is not the end of the situation in Syria, but obviously we'll talk about that more. In terms of the West, I think we've seen a couple of significant things which we're going to talk about, which I would call an anti-establishment uprising, which is, of course, the Brexit vote. Despite all of the media bias and distortion towards remaining within Europe, large numbers of the masses in this country, in Britain, turned out, one of the highest election turnouts, to vote to leave the European Union against the wishes of the main political establishment. And similarly, Donald Trump, although we've yet to see how this will be panning out, and in many ways we will see reversion to the mean, to the existing reality, but still the public did not buy the core establishment message. So there's some lessons in these events of what's happening. We've, of course, seen the establishment fight back, and again, maybe later this evening we can talk a little bit more about what I would term the war on cash. Again, we saw just a few weeks ago Prime Minister Modi in India start this process of banning cash, quite a radical move, again, which is directly against the public, to restrict their ability to trade and transact. It's not against terrorism. It's not against the the problem of the black market or things. This is a direct war against its citizenry, and we can expand a little bit upon that. So the establishment is certainly not going anywhere quickly, but we are seeing some upheavals happening. And again, this is an interesting point in time as we close out what is known as the 2016 year, and we look forward to what's happening next year, inshallah.
And I will now ask Brother Adnan to perhaps give us his opening remarks.
Okay. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum, brothers. Okay, when I look back over 2016, there were obviously many events that happened and many trends. Probably two things that really stick out for me, and I think it's probably worth watching in 2017. Firstly, obviously, is Brexit. And I don't mean this in the context of what this means for Britain. I mean what this means for Europe as a whole. The European Union was envisaged as a way to stop war on the European continent. Europe has a long history of war. World War I, World War II. You had the Napoleonic Wars, and we can go further back in history. Their way of resolving war and ensuring the continent didn't descend into chaos was this union, this economic union, which was going to turn into a political union. However, what you're finding now is this union is actually struggling to survive, and you've seen the first country in the history of the EU that actually plans to leave now. And there's many other countries, and there's many other opinions in other countries that also have a similar view of the European Union is not actually working for them. So we have the French elections coming up next year, where the far right is expected to do well. You have elections in Germany this year. You have elections potentially in Italy. And you have many other elections that are coming out where this is the opinion amongst them. So I think for 2017, this is actually something to watch, because you might really be seeing the unraveling of the European Union. The other trend really is linked to really Syria. This year, 2016, is the 100-year anniversary of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The agreement the French and the British drew up amongst each other to carve up the Middle East in the middle of World War I. And exactly 100 years after that agreement, what they envisaged is struggling to survive. The borders, the fake borders they created, the fake identities that they actually created is struggling to survive. And this is really what's taking place. It's what took place during the Arab Spring, and it's still really playing out in Syria. So I think these are really, in my mind, these were some of the key trends in 2016, and really two things to watch going into 2017, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Adnan. So I think both of you have put some food for thought. Hopefully the audience will mull over it and perhaps raise their questions or even comments. Can I go for the first question this evening from Brother Kobir, please?
Yeah, why is it?
So the first question is, just for the benefit of the online listeners, why is the conflict in Syria taking so long to end, whereas other Arab Spring countries such as Egypt and Tunisia eased off relatively quickly? Do you want to come in, Adnan, on that?
That's actually it's a very good question, actually. If we look at Tunisia today, if you look at Egypt, the old guard is back in power. You find, although in Tunisia, Ben Ali was overthrown, you look in Egypt, Mubarak was overthrown. These individuals were overthrown, but their regimes, their secret services remained in place. And what you find is remnants of those regimes are really back in power. What you find in Syria, the call to overthrow the whole regime was there from the beginning, and it's still really there today. And the Bashar al-Assad regime actually struggled to end and put down the rebellion. That's why it's taken the concentration of all of Bashar's forces, all of Russia, or a chunk of Russia's air force, a number of militia from Iran to really deal with one city. One city, okay, yes, it's one of the largest cities in Syria, but that's how much it took. That's how many years it took just to deal with one actual city. So in Syria, the people were much more clearer on what was needed and what was required. They understood the whole regime has to be overthrown. They understood, and Islam had a big place in that. In the other countries, the call really was more that the leader needs to go. And they achieved that to some degree. However, one person doesn't run a whole country. There's always a number of other individuals, institutions involved, and they remained in place. So we're seeing in Egypt now that people seem to be coming to that conclusion now. Sisi has resorted to all the old tactics of a police state to deal with the challenges that it's actually facing. And we're seeing in Tunisia, they're on the verge of another economic crisis as well. So the reason why there's really a difference is that people were a bit more clearer about what they wanted to achieve in Syria, whilst in the other countries, the understanding was if you overthrow the ruler, you would get change.
Adnan, can I just clarify? In your opening remarks, you said that the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the well-known agreement that was instrumental in carving up the Middle East, is now struggling to survive because these fake borders are struggling to exist. Now, I think critics would probably argue, if you look to the reality, 100 years on, the borders are still subsisting, and perhaps more importantly, the rulers of those countries are fighting tooth and nail to sustain those. So I wonder whether you could clarify what you meant by it.
So you would think after 100 years, that's probably enough time to create whatever fake identity you want to create, and it settles in the minds of people. Probably in 100 years, you've had 3 or 4 generations, really. After all that time, the fact that the rulers have to fight tooth and nail still to maintain those borders. And when I mean borders, I don't literally just mean the lines. I mean what those borders stand for. They stand for Jordanian. They stand for being an Iraqi. But that's what happened.
So you mean nationalism?
100 years ago, what the Muslims were told is this patch of land in the Middle East, you're Jordanian, right? And the concept of Jordanian didn't exist in history. It's literally plucked out of thin air. What we have over Iraq never existed in the sort they created it. Iraq, Al-Sham was what existed before there. What we have today of Palestine, of Israel, of Syria didn't exist in the past. That's what's struggling to actually survive, and that's why you're seeing some calls from some quarters, particularly over in the US, that the borders didn't go far enough. They see more countries being created in the particular region. So if you look at the various RAND reports, they're talking about Iraq being carved out into more countries. They're talking about Makkah and Medina becoming independent countries on their own, separate to Saudi. They see Alawi state in what we have in Syria today. So these countries, they're struggling to survive because the Europeans exported their view of what a nation should be. And this is completely foreign. What existed there was Islam. You had tribes, you had families. In the Middle East, the basic unit is the family. In the West, the basic unit is the individual. So they exported these foreign ideas, and yes, they required the brutal tactics of the rulers in order to implement this. But what you saw with the Arab Spring in 2011 is this last line of defense of brutal rulers, even that's not surviving anymore. So obviously, what we've seen with the Arab Spring is the opening gambit, really. It's not over. It's still ongoing. We're seeing that in Syria. But you'd think 100 years is enough time to really impose something on people.
Jazakallah khair for that. If the audience have anything, any questions or any comments specifically in relation to Syria or even Burma, feel free to come in. Jamal, I wonder whether you want to add anything to what Adnan has set out earlier on this subject specifically.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the thing so much in our minds today needs expand a little bit, which is that we have a responsibility. You know, al-Muslimu akhul Muslim. The Muslim is a brother of a Muslim. And he does not let him down. He does not oppress him. He does not hand him over to an oppressor. You know, this is a global responsibility of the Ummah in terms of this type of massacre which is going on. And this is why Muslims now, today, are feeling this issue. But it's not enough for us just to feel this issue. And when I say this issue, it's not that long ago that we had similar massacres. You know, what about our brothers in Gaza? What about our brothers in Sarajevo, Srebrenica, shock and awe attacking Baghdad? You know, this is not something new. This is a recent history whereby there is open and uncontrolled attacks, genocide, massacre, call it what you will, directed at core Muslim populations, large Muslim populations. It's maybe heightened more now because of social media, because of the global internet, that people can see and hear, you know, the pleas of 7-year-old children, you know, talking about what's happening to them in their homes. You know, so we have to think and reflect upon this and not just feel saddened in our hearts, but the responsibility we have is in terms of the liberation of these lands. The liberation of these lands from the oppressors which are waging these wars and attacks upon us. And that means the militaries of the Muslim world, of which we have, I mean, Adnan is, you know, quite an expert on this. He maybe can elaborate. But we have hundreds of thousands of troops, hundreds, literally hundreds of warplanes, you know, at a moment's notice, you know, to defend these people. Yet they're not. They are silent because the tyrants of these regions have them under lock and key. The Prophet ﷺ said, there's good in me and my ummatul yawmul qiyamah. So don't hear that the Muslim armies, by choice, are sitting back doing nothing. But it's our responsibility to unlock that resource by changing these governments. This is a political requirement. We have to politically change the governments in our lands. And that is the Islamic imperative that we are facing today. So it's not a question of us sitting back on our hands and doing nothing. We have to raise our work, raise our activism, raise our political works to change these governments and establish an Islamic polity, an Islamic system, an Islamic governance, a Khilafah system in our lands which will defend us. Again, the Prophet ﷺ said, behold, the Imam is a shield behind which you are protected and behind which you are fighting. So there's no way that we can have that protection without an imam, without a khalif. This is our responsibility. This is the reality today. And we can see it so clearly. Now is not the time to just mourn. Now is not the time just to feel sad. It is the time to have this direct determination that we are not going to allow another Srebrenica, another Sarajevo, another Aleppo, another Baghdad. This is what is happening. This is the reality for us.
We have a gentleman in the audience who wants to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Jamal. There was a study that talked about the N11 nations, the next 11 nations which are set to become amongst the world's largest economies. And what's interesting is that out of those 11 nations, 7 out of 11 are Muslim nations, countries like Turkey, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria. I mean, in the middle of everything else that's happening in the world, what's the true reality of this? Surely this is a sign of something maybe good that's happening in the world. I mean, these countries becoming amongst the world's biggest economies in terms of GDPs. Some of them have already are bigger than some of the European countries, their GDPs.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed us with incredible wealth in terms of our numbers, in terms of the resources, the oil, the gas, the minerals, in terms of our location, our strategic locations in the world. You know, the most important waterways are flowing around the Muslim lands. But more than this, of much greater importance than all of that, is that we are blessed with our thoughts, with our ideas, with our belief, with our iman, with Islam. This is the most powerful driving factor in the Muslim world. And this is our advantage, our key strategic advantage that we have over the secular, the neoliberal, the capitalist, failing economies, shrinking economies, dormant economies, which don't know where they are turning, corrupt economies, corrupt societies which are breaking down in terms of the social fabric of the people. Now, that's not to say we don't have problems in our world. Our problem stems from our lack of application of Islam. We have this incredible intellectual and spiritual drive that Islam gives us, that our deen gives us. Are we using it? Are we unifying? Where is that power of the ummah? In kuntum khayri ummah, ukhrijat lin-nas. Indeed, you are the best ummah brought forward for mankind. Why? Because we command what is right, we forbid what is evil, and we believe in Allah. We are the leading nation. But we have to live up to that position. This is the challenge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us all of that. What a blessing. But really it's falling on our shoulders to live up to that. You know, to be that leading nation and to be that nation of which the Prophet ﷺ will be proud. If not, there will be another generation which will be, following behind us that will undertake its responsibilities, and we will be the losers.
Thank you, Jamal. I've got a few more questions, but I just following on from what you said, a question pops to mind, which is you talk about the ummah, as Allah says in the Quran, the best ummah, the leading ummah in the mankind. But you came into Islam some 30 odd years ago, in your early days, and you will know this more than others in this room. Of course, Islam is the fastest rising religion in the world, and when non-Muslims look at Islam with all of these chaotic scenes around the Muslim world, what do you think is going through their mind? I mean, if they want to consider Islam as their way of life, how would you see it? I mean, you can probably relate to it a lot more than others. I
mean, there's a positive, there's a negative, there's an opportunity. I mean, the positive is, let's start with the negative, okay? Let's go a bit more positive. But the negative is this, is that you can't pick up a newspaper. You can't turn on a television. You can't listen to radio today without hearing Islam being attacked. Left, right, and center. It's backward. It's barbaric. It's, misogynistic. It's, you name it. There's attacks against Muslims, homophobic, Sharia law, ISIS. All of this stuff is the dominant narrative in the world today. It is the dominant narrative in the world today. You're going to see this in the next couple of weeks when people do their reviews. How much of it is related to Islam and the Muslim world. So that's the big negative. Now, the positive here is that why is this happening? It's because there is a revival. There is an intellectual revival happening. There is a change coming about in the Muslim lands. We saw the decline of the Ummah, and Adnan will elaborate on this more. I mean, Adnan is far more knowledgeable. In fact, he's just published a book on the history of the Middle East, available on Amazon. You may want to go pick it up. But the point is that in the Muslim world, we are seeing a change coming forward. And that forward means that this is why the gloves are off. This is why the West is attacking Islam and Muslims day and night. Because they can see this threat. They can see this threat which is happening. Now, the opportunity, the last point I'll say is that the opportunity is that, there's an expression, they say that no media is bad media. Okay, meaning no publicity is bad publicity. Maybe good, maybe bad, but it means that people are talking about it, talking about Islam. That means that there's a lot of open-minded people out there. There's a lot of people which have a yearning, a desire to understand the other side of the argument. I mentioned anti-establishment. There's people that cock their noses to what the government was saying about Brexit, for example. And the masses got out and they said, no, we're going to follow what David Cameron is saying. Now, we've got to get out there and present our case rather than let the EDL and the UKIPs of this world and the other racists and so on and so forth just attack us and our deen. So we have that opportunity because it is so high up in terms of the media agenda, meaning that we have an opportunity to present our case. So we shouldn't lose that.
I'll go back to the audience. Gentlemen here, you have a question.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Jazakallah khair, Jamal Howard, for saying to us that we should work for Islam, we should try to establish Khilafah. But a lot of, for the benefit of our listeners, because there's a lot of listeners who are listening as well, what practical actions can they take from this country here, living in UK? What can they do? What advice can you give them that they could do to get involved in establishing Islam?
I'm just going to repeat the question again for clarity. So Jamal Howard talked about working for Khilafah, the Islamic State. For the listeners who are in this country, in the UK, and perhaps across the West, what can they possibly do to achieve that endeavor and work for that goal?
Muslims have an obligation to work politically, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. وَتَقُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٍ يَرُؤُونَ الْخَيْرَ وَيَعْمَلُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Imran says, let there be from amongst you a group or groups calling to khair, calling to Islam, commanding what is right, the maruf, and forbidding the munkar, forbidding what is evil, and they are those which shall have success. So Allah is commanding us to organize ourselves into political movements. This is not militias, this is not military movements, that is a totally different area. But the question about political activism is a responsibility on the neck of the Muslims, whether you live in the UK, or you live in Asia, or you live in Europe, or you live in the Middle East, wherever you live, Muslim lands or non-Muslim lands, you need to be politically active. So the politically active Muslims in this country, of which the movement I work for Hizb ut-Tahrir. I worked for them for the last 28 years or whatever. The point is that we have a responsibility to present Islam to the public here in the West. We have a responsibility to unify the Muslims here behind their thoughts, to maintain their Islamic identity, and to maintain, critically, their linkage to the rest of the global ummah, to be part of this ummah, so that we are working globally for the call to resume the Islamic way of life, which will return in the Muslim world and re-establish the Islamic way of life, which means the Khilafah system. So Muslims in this country also can be part of this work. They need to be politically active in their communities, carrying the same call to our youth, to our elders, to our mosques, to the public, to the non-Muslims, to present Islam in terms of its thoughts and ideas, in terms of its aqidah, in terms of its beliefs, in terms of its systems and ways of life. So we have this responsibility, and we should not shy away from that.
Jazakallah khair. I'm conscious that time is marching on, so I'm going to try and couple questions together. Just to remind the audience, I can see a lot of people have joined in since we started. The subjects we're discussing in 2016 year in review are relating to Burma, Syria, Donald Trump's election victory, Brexit, and if we have time, possibly we may touch on prevent. So we've been discussing about Syria. Does anybody have any comment or question in relation to Burma or perhaps Donald Trump? Well, maybe in relation to Burma, if I could see a show of hands. If not, we can move to... Do you have a question relating to Burma? Okay, Burma and Syria. Please go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, given the situation of these things...
Okay, so just to summarize the three questions. One was about enjoining the good and forbidding evil, and whether that means just giving charity and lobbying to your local politicians, MPs, etc. And the other point is about unleashing the Muslim armies to alleviate the sufferings and pain on the Muslims of Syria, whether that's a realistic prospect and a realistic proposition, or is that being too optimistic about the reality. I want to go to Adnan for his comments.
Okay, so to begin with the brother's last point, I think you'll find the Ummah's already at war. We're the victims of war. It's not an issue of unleashing a war. The war's already been unleashed. So, our Ummah's being slaughtered, so we are at war.
Well, that's isolated, isn't it? That's what most Muslims are saying.
Yeah, that's fine. But so what you've really got there is the view on the issue needs to be looked at. We don't isolate ourselves from the rest of the Ummah. I accept that's what the Ummah does. So that's one of the things we got to. That's one of the things we need to do. So you're right. I mean, Burma and Syria. One of the challenges we've got is there seems to be different views on what's taking place. Some people say it's a sectarian battle, so let them fight it out. And when you look at Burma and you look at the other issues, there are some funny views out there, to be honest, about what's going on and how to actually deal with this. So, just to deal with the UN issue, how many times have the UN been involved and Muslims have been slaughtered? This is not the first time, is it? It's been happening for quite a few decades. So I think that solution is going to be looked at if anyone's proposing it. Now, don't get me wrong. Some people who are proposing these solutions, it's not out of insincerity. Yeah, it's not because they're sincere. It's not because they hate the Muslims. What you find, you see the pictures of Aleppo, you hope, you call for anything that would stop it. But what you've got to bear in mind, these are not isolated issues. These have been going on for a while. These are the results of other issues. And that has to be looked at. Otherwise, you're going to be reacting to the next slaughter. You're going to be reacting to the slaughter after that, and it'll be slaughter after slaughter. The key thing here is, brothers, is let's take Aleppo as a case study, yeah? And then we look at Burma. The Turkish border is only 25 miles away. Only 25 miles away. You can work out how long it takes you in a car to do 25 miles. The Turkish government actually funded and armed a number of the rebel groups initially that were fighting in Aleppo. The Nuruddin Zinki Brigade was armed initially by America and then by Turkey. When it came to the most critical hour, they abandoned them. That's what. So there's not a lack of capability here. There's not a lack of thing. The Turkish army could end the Syrian issue in a week. The Bashar al-Assad's forces that are fighting in Aleppo, they're not even mostly Bashar al-Assad's forces. These are Iranian militia and Russian air force. He lacks the manpower to even take back Aleppo. It took 4 years of concentrated force in one town of Syria just to take it back from who? 250,000 civilians and around 8,000 to 10,000 rebel groups, rebel fighters. That's the situation we're facing here. The Turkish army has been involved in Turkey. It went and took over a shrine, old Ottoman shrine. That was more valuable for the Erdogan government than the slaughter that took place in Aleppo. Right? If the Turkish army was to intervene in Syria, there's actually very little the Syrian regime can actually do. Russia has got a bigger problem than Syria. It's got Ukraine. Half its forces are engaged over there. Does it really have the capability on this war expanding? And remember, Russia's only fighting from the air. It doesn't have troops on the ground.
And there is no border. This is a false border that you mentioned.
So
this is a false border you mentioned.
Absolutely. So that border, to be honest, Al-Sham in the past historically included the south of Turkey. What is today? That's how artificial the border is. So these borders exist only in the mind. In reality, they don't actually exist. And to be honest with you, with what's been going on in Syria, the borders become quite irrelevant. So yes, you've got all sorts of solutions out there. I mean, even charity, to be honest with you, we should help our brothers and sisters. But that's not going to deal with the ultimate problem. So I'm not knocking charity. You give that. And in fact, charity is something you do continuously. But we have a specific problem here of the Muslim world being slaughtered. We have a problem of the Muslim world actually possessing the capability to even deal with this. You've got countries like Saudi, who is usually the second or the first major purchase of arms every year. You've got Burma, which is a third world country, doesn't even have infrastructure. Any of the Muslim armies could have dealt with this. This could have been finished. The point is they've made political calculations where they don't bother. So Saudi sees it more important to go into Yemen, more important to go into Bahrain, but Palestine and obviously Burma isn't very important. That's your problem right there. That's your problem right there. That's where your problem is. So yes, we do the action that we do continuously, which is give charity. We do the actions where we expose. But there's another set of actions we need to do in order to deal with these political issues. So it's quite interesting actually. In Turkey, there's been a number of individuals who have been in Turkey who have been quite surprised the Turkish army didn't intervene in Aleppo. This is from the Turkish people themselves. I'm sure the cries of Aleppo can be heard in South Turkey. It's not that far away. I'm sure the bombings from the Russian jets can actually be heard from there. So although Aleppo, Syria and Burma are two different parts of the world, the problem's actually the same. I mean, what's worse is that these Muslim countries don't even take the Rohingya Muslims in. That's something you should be able to do easily as a minimum. So that's your problem that you've really got there. So all these other solutions of lobbying these foundations, it's all like muddy what's going on. So, I was at work today and a lot of people in my office are like, what's going on in Aleppo? I thought this sectarian battle's just gone really mad. And I deconstructed it for them. The people rose up against a brutal dictator. He could have been a Sunni leader, the same thing would have happened. This is not a sectarian uprising. The regime made it into a sectarian one, but they needed sectarian support. Hosni Mubarak was a Sunni leader. Gaddafi was a Sunni leader. That's irrelevant on the issue. So what you can do, and this goes back to your point, what you can do sitting here, you and Muslims in the West need to make the case for Islam. You need to deal with the myths and the propaganda, a lot of it which is produced in the capitals in the West, that muddy these issues. So what's interesting is not so long ago, everyone was saying, Bashar's bad, yeah, but ISIS is far worse. What that meant was, Bashar's actually better, we can actually work with this guy. You got some people even saying maybe now the opposition, the rebels, should negotiate with Bashar. So that's what you can do sitting in the West. You deal with the propaganda, you expose the propaganda. With social media, it is literally at your fingertips. It isn't necessarily all about going on TV and doing this. And what you find, a lot of people are confused. The Middle East is this complex region, right? And bear in mind, there's a lot of lazy journalists. You have two Muslims fighting, it must be sectarian. It has to be sectarian. Bear in mind, in Syria, only about 10 to 15% of the population is Alawi. How on earth are these guys in power? It goes back to 100 years ago, they were put into power on purpose. So how is it that 60, 70% of the population, they've risen up against a minority of the population? That's why for the Alawis, they have to fight this out. They lose this, it's over for them. And that's why you see these tactics in Aleppo. What that tactic is, anyone who rises against the rule in the region, expect this. That's the message they're trying to send. So we need to counter that propaganda. Yeah? And the number one way to do that, we got armies 25 miles up the road. Turkey, even as a minimum, even if it didn't send its army, they could have actually armed the rebel groups. That would have actually made a difference. They didn't even do that. So what you've got a scenario here is not capability. You've got actions that are easy for them to do, and they've done it in the past. Turkey took out a Russian jet. But on the most critical hour of Aleppo, they actually abandoned them. And that's got to be exposed.
Just going to quickly see if Jamal has anything to add, because I'm going to move on to the next topic. We've got about 15 minutes left, so time is marching on. I want to move on to the subject of, if you have any questions on the subject of Donald Trump's victory in the US and Brexit in this country. I believe somebody had questions earlier. Yes, brother here.
I wanted to ask, we've seen something strange happen for me.
Okay, Jazakallah khair for that. Jamal?
We saw this financial crisis in 2008, and, here we are 8 years later, and the economies haven't really recovered. This is a massive bailout of the banking system, and the banking system really traditionally has got the closest relationship with the major political parties, whether they're Republican, Democratic, Conservative, even Labour, close links between the ruling elites in these parties. Therefore, no surprise that a lot of the policies which we've seen in the last few years have been, again, banker-driven. And in that environment, we've seen globalization, we've seen a drift away from traditional manufacturing and industry in these major countries towards China and Southeast Asia. And the people, they're beginning to see a wealth difference. The massive difference between the wealthy and the poor is getting wider and wider. And as a result of that, we begin to see a backlash against that. A lot of northern towns in Britain seeing, their living standard, decimated. The Rust Belt across the Midwest in the U.S. Decimated. So it's an environment which was ripe for sort of an anti-establishment thing. But what happens is we are just seeing what the media is giving to us. So you're seeing on the BBC, you're seeing NBC, ABC, CNBC, all these major news outlets carrying a core establishment message. So you can have candidates like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn coming up as a bit of a protest. That's not to say that these guys have the right solutions, right? But they're saying something different against the main power elites. And that has struck a chord. Trump himself was not even supported by the Republican Party. In fact, they did everything they could to, squash his candidacy. And even today, they're looking in terms of what's the role of Russia, hackers, or this or that, all sorts of things going on behind the scenes. But the core message is, it's not that Trump is not a capitalist, is not going to maybe or likely to continue most of the same policies which we've seen for the last 20, 30 years in the US. It's just that he was not the core establishment candidate. The Hillary Clinton that was backed by all of the major arms manufacturing companies in the world, that was backed and funded by the major banking institutions in the world, that was backed by virtually all of the major news media sources in America. For somebody to go against all of that and to get the victory is actually quite a significant thing. It's actually maybe something that we need to study and understand a little bit more. But what it means, though, is that there is a lot of discontent amongst the general public in terms of what's happening. So we see a lot of this in terms of the Snowden effect, a lot of this in terms of they know that we're being lied to with the media, the rise of alternative media, the rise of social media, and all these types of things is actually a development which is indicating to us that the public are not just taking what they're being fed, have been fed for the last X number of years.
Adnan?
So going back to your point, brother, what we can do, here you go. You've got, people can feel, because of the financial crisis, that there's a problem with their system. They haven't quite worked out what the problem is. But they see these establishment politicians, these mainstream politicians, this mainstream politics isn't working for them. So what you find is this is why unconventional parties, the unconventional individuals are getting more of a say. And this is why, for example, you've got, like in Greece, you've got people who were actors 2-3 years ago coming into power. That's why you got Trump, reality TV, businessman coming into power. That's why you get a situation where there's no policy. But he's different. He's not a mainstream politician. That's why people are prepared to invest in them. But within just a month or so, I mean, I don't think the Americans have realised now, he's putting all of Wall Street into power. He's bringing all these military men back. He's bringing all the mainstream guys back to power. And bear in mind, if he's got no policy, what's he going to do? He's just going to go with the same. So I was reading the other day, one survey into Trump showed that on 13 policy positions, he's changed his opinion 27 times. I'm not sure that's actually possible. That's how bad the situation is. And what you've got there is the American public just wanted something different. And that's what he did. So you turn up to a debate and all you do is effectively slag off the other person. How on earth can you get voted in? But that was different. He's not mainstream. And that's what's allowed him to actually get through. And you're seeing, and this is why the elections coming up now in Europe, there's a big worry. These right-wing groups, these Marine Le Pen groups, these guys are going to do well because what people are finding now is mainstream politics isn't working for us. In fact, what mainstream politics got them wasn't just a financial crisis, but austerity was imposed. Even the solution to solve it was, we're going to impose it upon the people who have been most affected by it. So this is the best opportunity you're going to have for a long time to really make the case for an alternative. And, you know, we see a lot of numbers. I think even the term trillions just become normal now. We're talking about real human beings here. We're talking about people who are struggling to pay their bills. In America, the amount of people who are homeless, you look at cities like Detroit, which were the manufacturing hubs back in the day. These are like, you know, they make apocalyptic films there now. That's how bad these things are. So there are real people here, humans who are looking for a solution. And for them, if you think about it, all they really see at the moment is Republicans, Democrats. You really just got Trump. These are people, and across Europe, mainstream politics isn't working. And this is why the right wing seem a bit more favourable now. This is why it's unconventional politics. And this is why we have a great opportunity, really, to actually put a realistic alternative there.
On this question of alternative, Jamal, you touched on Donald Trump's election victory. We know that democracy is beamed across the Muslim world as the panacea for the conflict that are taking place in the Middle East. What does, in your view, what does the recent US election show about democracy?
I mean, you know, it's fundamentally flawed. I mean, you have an electoral college system in the US, which means that the public can go along and vote for candidates of the Democrat or candidates of the Republicans. Now, via all sorts of shenanigans and restructuring things, a victory which probably was going to go to Bernie Sanders was hijacked by the Democratic National Convention. So they basically put in a candidate which they imposed, which was their establishment candidate, which Hillary Clinton, seen as their safe candidate, whereas Bernie Sanders was actually more popular generally amongst their followers. So that's flaw number one. They have this party structure which can basically override the will of the people. Flaw number two is that when people come to vote, it's not a straightforward thing that says, well, people go to the polls and whoever wins the vote. Hillary Clinton actually won a greater share of the overall vote than Trump did. But because you go state by state, and each state will have a certain number of what they call the Electoral College, which way the state votes, all of those votes then go to that candidate. So if the state goes, for Trump, then that Electoral College need to support Trump, although that's also a question now because of this so-called Russian hacking. I mean, you wouldn't believe it, what's going on in terms of the games which are being played. But anyway, it's fundamentally flawed. And a third point, because what if you didn't like Trump and you didn't like Clinton? And that was basically one of the core messages. Who was the least worse? The lesser of two evils, whatever you want to say. Nobody liked Trump. Nobody liked Clinton. It was kind of like, gosh, I don't like either of these guys. Anyone but these guys. And they have a couple of independents going. But the way the media and the coverage and everything else, an independent's got no chance, which doesn't have the big party machinery behind them. But, this is a two-party system. But when you actually break it down, the Republicans and the Democrats, they're the same thing. They have the same policies. Bush, is attacking wars. Obama said he's going to close down Guantanamo. He never did. Obama ramped up the drone attacks. He did far more drone attacks than Bush did. I mean, where is this, liberal change, anti-war change, change you can believe in. It's hocus pocus. It's nothing there. Make America great again. It's not happening. As Adnan mentioned, he's put a lot of Goldman Sachs bankers into key positions, and he was talking against Goldman Sachs, throughout his campaign, and that now he's just turned around immediately, and he's done an about turn, and he's putting them into power again.
Clearly not the way forward for the Muslim world, then.
No, I mean, this is one of the sad things is that we have been sold, for the last 50 years, this idea, democracy and so on and so forth. There's two core matters in democracy. One is that you put man as sovereign. Man decides, Parliament decides, your Congress, your legislative body decides, and that is completely forbidden in Islam. Inil hukmu illa lillah. The ruling is only with Allah. The sovereignty is with Allah. The second part of democracy, okay, you have representative rule. Yes, we agree. We have a right to vote for our representatives in a majlis, for example, in a assembly of the ummah. And then from there they will appoint a khalif. So we have a representative rule. You have voting in Islam. But we do not have sovereignty to man. We do not put sovereignty in the hands of bankers or major corporate interests which are going to control major ruling parties who are going to rule on their behalf, on behalf of the 1%, the elites of the society. That's the thing which has been sold to us, and it's being applied to us. And we've got to oppose that.
Adnan, very briefly, if you want to come in, because we've got about 5 minutes left.
Just a quick point on Trump, really. Bear in mind the background of Trump. He's not a politician. He's never held office, and now he holds the keys to the nuclear weapons of America. So the problem he faces, really, he actually has very few positions on most issues. So what you're seeing now is people who do have positions on policy issues, he's bringing them in. He's bringing them into his cabinet. He's bringing them into his governance. So what that really means is, a lot of and you're seeing a lot of these are white supremacist guys. A lot of these guys have got some very funny views about a lot of issues, and it reminds me of when the neocons come to power. These were wackos who came to power, had this thing about regime change in the Muslim world, and look at what it's done to the US. But bear in mind, for the American people, this was a vote against the establishment. That sentiment is actually there. They will learn. It took them about a year after Obama to learn there's no great change coming with Obama, and they'll probably learn even quicker now that change isn't actually coming with Trump. So you're going to see a lot more discontent in the US, and that may actually be America's biggest problem going forward. It's not external, it's not China necessarily or Russia, it's actually going to be internal. So that's actually something to watch going forward. Just briefly on democracy, for them, the biggest advantage of democracy is you make up the rules as you go along. You legislate yourselves. So what you find is these few people who lead in these countries, they make the rules that basically are favourable to them. And that's the biggest problem with democracy. Even the democracy or the so-called democracy that exists in our countries, what do? They make the rules that are favourable to them. They make the rules that allow them to be corrupt and do what they do. Alternative, what we have in Islam is the rules are already enshrined. The job of the ruler is to implement those laws. Everybody can see those laws. They're written, they're enshrined. We've been writing them throughout our history. Therefore, you can clearly account the leader when he's diverging from Islam. In the West, as you can see, you're seeing with rules to do with Muslims, you're doing with security, they can make up the rules as they go along. And that's actually the biggest flaw.
Jazakallah khair. I'll take the final question from the audience.
Assalamu
Wa alaikum salam.
2016 for the Muslims have been really painful and very horrific. Saying that, what does 2017 have for the Muslims?
Okay, so I'll just repeat that question. 2016 has been very difficult, painful and horrific for the Muslims. What does 2017 hold? And I think with that question in mind, I'll ask both of the panel members to perhaps answer that question and sort of incorporate their closing remarks.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I mean, it's said that it is darkest before the Fajr. So we don't know when the real change is going to be coming in the Muslim world, but we have been seeing in the last few years, we've seen the Arab Spring, we've seen uprisings, we've seen incredible change. I mean, the key change I would highlight is that we've seen the the fear of the regimes has dropped. This is what we learned from this Arab Spring, is that the fear, because, I remember 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people would say, listen, brother, I like this, we want to see a change, but listen, it's not going to happen because nobody's going to be able to stand up to a Mubarak. Nobody's going to stand up to a Saddam or an Assad or anyone. It's not going to happen. So that fear has been shattered. That fear has gone. And I really believe that out of this appalling massacre that we're seeing in Aleppo, for an example, you're seeing a resilience in this ummah saying that we cannot let this type of thing continue. I don't think the Muslims of Syria are going to back down easily. I don't think the Muslims throughout the region are going to be backing down easily. They are seeing in greater starkness and greater contours the reality of these regimes and what they are doing in terms of restricting us and keeping us from Islam. So we need to work and continue to build on that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give the victory where He feels and when He feels. But it is our responsibility. We don't know when we will die. We don't know whether we will be here at this time next year. We can't sit there in that type of time frame and be saying that, it's got to happen now, it's got to happen this, it's got to be that. We cannot be downhearted. We cannot be, defeatist. We have to be looking forward and positively looking forward, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised the victory to the believers. So we want to be part of that.
Jazakallah khair. Adnan, your last comments, please.
Okay, for me, maybe if you look at a slightly longer timeline, but I'll keep it short, is, for at least over a decade now, we've been constantly told about the superiority of their system. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was the end of history, it was the end of the development of ideas, and basically capitalism had won. And what we're finding really a couple of decades later, it's actually struggling. You find if you look beneath the surface, it's actually very hollow. You've got massive wealth inequality, you've got the Western public don't trust their politicians, you've got corruption that some of our rulers will be quite proud of actually taking place. So when you look beneath this all, there's actually very little there. So what you're finding is their best form of defense is just to create as many lies as you can against the other, Muslims and Islam. You guys are sectarian, you guys are backward, you guys can't do this, you guys aren't educated. That's actually their best line of defense when look at the numerous problems they face. And I think going forward, you're going to see this. You're seeing Westerners opening up to this. And with the Arab Spring, the idea of change is there. It's there on the Muslim mind. It's possible. If the Arabs can do it, anyone can actually do it. And I think going forward, that's a big problem for them. You're seeing think tanks writing so much stuff where this is going to end. And I think this is a lesson where we can take that, change is in the air, really. And it's really about making a case for Islam and even really presenting this to non-Muslims, because there's a lot of discontent amongst them as well. So this so-called superiority, really, when you look beneath the surface, is actually quite hollow. You've got people searching for other stuff, and you're seeing the mainstream, you're seeing the establishment really struggling to actually make a case. And their best, really, argument against all of this is really attacking immigrants, attacking Muslims, attacking a group called ISIS on the other side of the world. Their best form of defense is to create loads of other lies. So this really it represents a really good opportunity for us to present an alternative.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Adnan and Jamal, and I want to thank the audience for attending tonight's show. Sadly, time is up, and inshallah we'll bring this evening's show to a close. Just a final remark. I've just been advised by the producers that we've had just over 200 live listeners to this radio show, and I've been asked to correct my earlier error. Straight Talk is not on Wednesdays, it is in fact on Thursdays. So apologies to the producers of Straight Talk. Jazakallah khair to you all for attending, and inshallah until next time, maybe there will be more joint events between THMP and Straight Talk. And of course, thank you to the live listeners, and I do hope that you've enjoyed and hopefully the session has been thought-provoking. So inshallah, until next time, assalamu alaikum. Rabbana taqabbal minna innaka antas samiul alim wa tub alayna ya maulana innaka antat tawwabur rahim.
Middle Path Radio, your source of Islamic knowledge.